Speedy service. That's what UP Express strives to succeed. Good afternoon, Shelley and Patrick. My name is Stephanie. This is Paul, Tony, Calvin, and Isa, and we are part of the task force that was to present the potential pricing scheme. So today we're going to be talking about the tasks that we were assigned, which are the income statements and break-even analysis, the pricing options and the ridership projection, as well as the promotional campaign. So now I'm just going to pass it on to Paul, who's going to be talking about the income statements and the break-even analysis.
We prepared income statements for 4 years, 2015 to 2018, and we did so on 3 assumptions. The first assumption states that the price is going to be $20 and that all costs are going to be as predicted. Now I'd like to point out attention to a few of the knowable points we have and the assumptions we made in creating these values. The first should be depreciation, capital depreciation right here. We calculate depreciation on the assumption that there was going to be a residual value, as it would be unrealistic for such a large expenditure with expensive equipment to not have residual value. We calculate this based on going onto the TTC website and finding its statements for 2012. Based on these statements, we found the depreciation for 2 things, notably subways and buildings which are similar to our own DMUs and train stations. We found how much had been depreciated and how much was due to depreciated compared with the total cost of each item, and based on that we calculated the percentage, residual value percentage that is, that was due to be remaining for each expenditure. It was something like 22% for each one. Then we simply applied that to our own items to find the percentage of our residual value. Then for the remaining 80 or so percent, we divide that up, found that about 80% was depreciation, and divide that per year. In this case, depreciation is 11 million, but in ordinary years it's approximately 14 million. I'd also like to point out our developments and planning. We decided not to treat that as a capital expenditure. We decided to treat it as an expense because it is only as incurred, and it will not be incurred again, and it cannot be depreciated. As a result of that, we divided the $40 million incurred between 2013 and 2015 into certain segments. We multiplied that by the number of months applied in 2015 to get $8 million here. The net result is that although we have a substantial net loss, much of this is comprised of our development costs, even with our lower depreciation and our combination with lack of demand. Our break-even analysis will show that we do have a substantial number of units sold, which is higher. That is 3 million units sold, which is higher than the units sold we need in order to break even. However, we will accumulate demand over the years, as will be shown by their income statements. Now, our next assumption was that we would incur another $5 million in fixed costs, as it can be shown here, as additional fixed expenses. This $5 million adds to our fixed expenses and does decrease our profit, but it does so in a uniform manner throughout the years. So not further much analysis is needed of that. Only note that it does decrease our net loss and increases the number of units we need to sell by an even amount in the break-even analysis, which can be shown each year. Note that it's increased our units need to be sold by approximately 300,000. Finally, our third analysis rests on the assumption that our price would increase to $22.50. Note that even though our price has increased, our net loss is significantly higher. This is due to the fact that we adjusted for the fact that demand would dramatically decrease. As a result, we calculate how much demand would decrease by based on the amount of 70% decrease overall, and adjusted our units sold to match that, and then adjusted our price and profit. Our price could show, however, that even though our loss is significantly increased, we need to sell fewer units due to the higher price to make it break even. Now, our 2016 statements. Our development costs are all gone because now that the service is in place, there is no further need for them. However, our depreciation has been adjusted for it to be a higher $14 million, as can be shown here. Overall, though, our demand does increase and our costs do decrease, resulting in a lower net loss. Our break-even analysis will also show that we need to sell fewer units to make a break-even point. That is to say, approximately 1 million fewer units, which is substantial. Now, our $5 million additional in fixed costs will show that we do increase our net loss, but however, this once again is by uniform amount, and our break-even analysis will show that we only need to sell marginally more amount of units to cover that. As can be shown here, we're going to sell approximately 5 million more units. Now, for our increase in price. Again, because of the lack of demand, although there is more demand, the increase in price also does not change it much. As a result, we do have a substantial loss. However, this is much less significant of a loss than the 2015 one. Our break-even analysis will also show that we do need to sell fewer units. Although, however, note that these revenues and the number of units sold remain constant throughout the years. A 2017 analysis will show a far more increased sales and, for the very first time, a small but fairly substantial operating income. A break-even analysis will show that this is the very first time in a number of years that we actually have to sell fewer units than those we actually sell in order to make a profit. This is largely due to the fact that our expenses have stabilized and the fact that demand has increased. Our $5 million, as can be shown right here, our $5 million increase in fixed expenses does, however, once again guarantee us a substantial net loss. However, this is predictable. It will always guarantee a net loss for us in these years, and as the break-even analysis will show, once that we only need to adjust our units sold upwards by a small amount to once again meet the break-even. Now, our increase in price actually does, due to the higher demand, bring us a fairly more substantial revenue. However, this still does result in a significant net loss. Our break-even analysis will show, though, that every year we have fewer and fewer units to sell in order to make a break-even point, reflecting the increased demand. Finally, our 2018 statements. 2018 is the very first year in which our profits are in fact substantial, 4.5 million and getting close to 5 billion. Our break-even analysis will show that also the number of units we need to be sold is far lower than the actual number of units we sell in order to make a break-even. Our $5 million in fixed expenses does once again result in a net loss, but this is fairly low. And our break-even analysis will show once again that very fewer and fewer units do need to be sold to cover this. Finally, our last assumption, an increase in price to $22.50, does once again make a fairly stable $92 million in revenue due to the lack of demand, and does make a net loss. However, as can be shown, this pricing scheme every year does result in fewer units having to be sold to make the break-even point. Now, we looked at all these income statements with a certain pricing scheme, that is either $20 to $22.50, but this is not realistic because there are multiple stations. People will not be traveling to all of the stations. So we needed to develop a new pricing scheme which would optimize revenues and profits for us and better cover costs. To do that, we turn to Tony.
So before we began our development of a actual variable pricing scheme, there were certain pieces of information that we had to take into account. One of the assumptions that was actually used within the income statements was the fact that Metrolinx could potentially incur up to $5 million of additional fixed expenses. The Auditor General's report specifically states that such an outcome was extremely likely due to the nature of our contract, and they've also stated that we may have to raise our ticket prices up to as much as $28. As such, we've decided that it was a prudent decision to include such costs into our estimations. From our point of view, we felt that including the assumption would provide us with a buffer or cushion zone in the event that we actually incur these costs. Now, we'll get into more detail on how we came about with the prices we did, but for the moment, let's take a look at the actual pricing scheme we've developed. There will be 3 prices, each representing a different number of stops. Now, in the red there, priced at $14.25, we have a representation of the 1 stop, going from Pearson to Weston. In the yellow price at $20.25, we have a representation of 2 stops, going from Pearson to Bloor and Dundas. And finally, in the black, going at $21.25, we have a representation of 3 stops going from Pearson all the way to Union Station. So now that you have a general overview of our pricing scheme, Calvin will explain in a little bit more detail how we came about with these prices.
So what we want to focus on with our variable costing is equality. Like many companies creating a new pricing scheme, we look to our competitors, taxis, airport busing, and airport parking. Now 2 of those competitors, airport parking and airport busing, are privately owned and therefore not regulated, and thus we won't be using them as a fair comparison. What we're going to look at is taxis. Now in this table you'll see a situation in where taxis take all of our projected riderships in 2017, our stable year. So we're going to apply 3 million of our riders to the taxi fares, and we're going to assume that 75% of riders will be riding from Union to Pearson, 15% will be riding from Bloor to Pearson, and 10% will be riding from Weston to Pearson, like the case estimates indicate. Now, what you can see from that is you can derive a percentage of the revenue that should be coming from each station. What we do with these revenues in this next table is we apply them to our break-even revenue of 2017, given the additional 5 million incurred in fixed costs. Now, as a group, we've come to the conclusion that these percentages are indeed accurate because they are fairly relative and close to the estimates of ridership projections. And so you will see the portion of revenue that comes from each station, and when you divide it by the amount of estimated riderships per route, you will get a rough estimate of a price, in which we polish to create $21.25 for Pearson Union, $20.25 from Bloor Union, Bloor Pearson, and 1425 from Weston Pearson. Now we can